being a libertarian talk show host or anything like that. I don't say things on the show to try to check a box because that's what a talk show host is supposed to say. I mean, if anybody's been listening to my show for more than a few hours, you probably know that I don't do that stuff. I've been target shooting since I was a little kid, since my dad taught me how to shoot with a Browning BL-22 lever action rifle that I now bought one of and I can teach my kid. So am I passionate? Less than some, more than others. I probably have, a couple dozen guns, right? So that's more than some people and less than some people. Anyway, I do like them. Am I passionate? I'll leave that to you. But one guy who is passionate, I don't know if he's passionate about guns because he lives in Illinois, and I used to live in Illinois, and it's hard to get away with being passionate about guns in Illinois. But I digress. Justin Haskins is the editorial director and a research fellow at the Heartland Institute, and you've seen him quite a few times on Fox News with my friend Tucker Carlson, and I saw him on Fox and Friends the other day, which reminded me to get Justin on the show. And when Justin was on Fox and Friends, he was talking about his new book, Socialism Is Evil, which you can actually download and read for free, and we'll get you those links in a bit. But joining us to talk about socialism as evil, the man himself, Justin Haskins. Hey, Justin, it's great to get you on the show for the first time.
Yeah, it's great to finally be on with you.
And I mentioned Heartland Institute. I used to be on the board of directors of the Heartland Institute, and I remain a senior fellow of the Heartland Institute, whatever that means. I wish I got paid for whatever that means, but I don't get paid anything for it. But anyway, Justin and I share that affiliation. Now, one of the things that I like so much about your take on socialism, and I think it's right, and I think it's really important, and you're one of the few people that I've heard actually talk about it in public, especially in a way that the broader public can really try to grasp onto, is that the proper discussion about socialism is not primarily about, or at least should not be limited to, its practical effects. There is a moral case against socialism that's important.
That's exactly right. I think that one of the biggest mistakes that those of us who support individual liberty have made in this whole war over socialism that's been going on now for a very, very long time, going all the way back to the 1800s, is that we have abandoned the moral high ground in a sense and said, allowed socialists to make the claim that their policies really are all about just helping people, making the world a better place, and that we're relegated to this position of these policies don't work. Here's a bunch of other policies that would work instead, and here's a better economic system. Capitalism is better than socialism, and we talk about the effects of it and the economics of it, and I am 100% totally in agreement with all of those points. Mm-hmm. I believe all of that. But there is a extremely, extremely strong moral argument against socialism that says, effectively, regardless of whether or not socialism actually works better than capitalism. And again, I don't believe that it does, but even if it does, it still would be a deeply immoral system. Because whenever you put the collective in front of the individual, which is a necessity in every single socialist system that you can come up with, what you end up doing is you end up taking away the rights of the individual person and forcing them not only to not have a certain right to do something, but you're forcing them to participate in an activity that they might believe is deeply immoral themselves. The most obvious example of this that everybody can sort of relate to, regardless of what you might believe about abortion or not, is that there are lots of people who believe that abortion is immoral, that it's wrong. But if you have a socialized healthcare system that has abortion featured in it, then that means that everybody in that society is required to pay for abortion, regardless of whether they believe abortion is wrong. And the same is true for a whole bunch of other issues. Once you start socializing various aspects of an economy, you force people to participate in activities they believe are immoral or even in many cases against their religious beliefs. And I believe that forcing those people to participate in those actions is in and of itself a deeply immoral thing to do.
Here's part of what I think is going on here, Justin, and I don't know how old you are, but I know you're a lot younger than I am. And this has been going on.
I'm 32.
Okay, right. So, yes, you're a lot younger than I am. So, this has been going on for a long time. Here's something that where'd you go to college?
I went to college at the University of Richmond in Virginia.
And what was that like?
It was, it was a liberal arts school. Lots of wealthy kids, leans left, but not crazy to the left. But it was a left-leaning college.
One of the things that seemed to be happening when I was in college, literally, 20-something years before you were in college, and I bet was happening in your college, and I know was happening in colleges now, is that kids are either not being taught the idea of individual liberty or overtly being taught the idea that individualism, individual liberty is immoral, and that the wishes and well-being of any individual should be made secondary to the wishes and well-being of a theoretical collective. And I think that is leading more and more people to not understand the moral arguments that you and I both make against socialism.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that one of the things that's been going on, really for going all the way back to the early progressive era in the early 1900s, is that what socialists and progressives have done is they've wrapped themselves in the American flag, and they found groups that have been frankly treated very poorly historically. And what they've done is they've gone to those groups and they've said, look, your freedom, whatever freedom it happens to be, has been taken away from you. Your liberty has been taken away from you. And then they wrap themselves up they use language like freedom and liberty and keeping the government out of the bedroom. And they say things like that, while simultaneously building a coalition that wants to take away everyone's individual rights in virtually every aspect of life, except for those little carve-outs that are made for these marginalized groups that they're trying to build into a coalition. And so they are allowed to use freedom language and appeal to Americans who are, I think, at baseline supporters of freedom. That's just part of our culture. And young people who don't understand the history of how these ideas have worked throughout the course of human civilization, how this has never been a good idea. It's never been good to put the collective over the individual. And they've said, look, you can support freedom. This is about freedom. This is about helping people, and it's about freedom. And if you don't know the history of these movements, and you don't know that this was a very deliberate marketing attempt to change what progressivism means and to change what socialism means in the early 1900s, if you don't know the history of all of that, it's easy to lose that importance, that really what we're talking about here fundamentally is that one side wants to eliminate certain people's rights, completely eliminate them, including core rights, core responsibilities, and core rights. And this is why in every single society where this has ever been tried, you see people losing their individual liberty, even though you might have a constitution that says that you have freedom of speech. They take away freedom of speech. Mm-hmm. Same thing with religion, same thing with assembly, same thing with everything. The Soviet Union promised all those things, and then they just took them away, even though it was in their constitution. So it's because when you put the collective first, the individual always comes last, and the individual will eventually be you someday. That's the way it always works.
So I want to respond to a couple of things. You said that support of individual liberty is part of our culture. I worry that is being taught out of an entire generation or two of young Americans. And that, look, I'm not someone who thinks this is going to disappear, but I think support for individual liberty as an end in itself, which is where I am. I think that is being trained out of our children and has been trained out of our young adults. And I find it quite frightening, because I do think, again, along the lines of the stuff you're talking about here, I think there are more Americans than ever who are willing to sacrifice even a little bit of their own individual liberty in pursuit of their own wokeness, so that they can say, I'm a good person and I'm helping the collective. And it does frighten me. For those of you just joining, my very special guest, Justin Haskins, editorial director at the Heartland Institute, author of Socialism Is Evil. You can go to stoppingsocialism.com and download the book for free. So what do you think? And I mean, I know I feel like I'm harping on this sort of cultural educational piece, but to me that is a true source of why socialism even if it's not exactly winning in the United States, it's not losing the way it should be.
Right. And I think you're 100% right. I would say that it's being trained out of younger people, but it's being done in a way, it's being done by redefining what freedom means. So that it means something that it historically never meant. And this is something that the left has been doing in America forever. That's why anyone who knows anything about history knows that historically, classical liberalism is not liberalism as we understand it today. The reason for that, it's the opposite, in fact. The reason why we have liberalism today, the reason they call it that, is precisely because there was a deliberate choice to change the wording of their ideas to connect with an idea that Americans thought of as being something that was inherently part of their identity, a national identity of supporting freedom and individual liberty and all these things. And they said, you can support that and support all these social programs and all of these, the government intrusions in your life because they're somehow related. It's that area that needs to be addressed. And I think the best way to address it with younger people is to make them understand that when you support certain ideas that they think are just sort of common sense, if you care about the world, you support these ideas, it means you're doing harm to someone else's rights. And then force them to confront that so that if you support a social program that guarantees abortion, you are forcing someone who believes it's against their religious beliefs. You're forcing nuns and devout Roman Catholics and devout Christians and people who just for whatever reason think that it's wrong to have an abortion. You're forcing them to not only live in a society that has it, but you're forcing them to pay for it, to actually own the hospitals or own the health insurance, so to speak, apparatus that pays for all of this. You're forcing them to contribute with their tax dollars.
Okay, so
why would you make someone do that?
And I would say if you went to either where you went to college or where I went to college at Columbia University and posed that question to students today, they would say, who cares? Make them pay for it. It's just the right thing to do. I don't care about their so-called individual liberty because they want to use their individual liberty to do things that are wrong, which really means to do things that they don't agree with. But that's how they'd say it. And I think that the argument that you're making, even though it is the correct argument, is a loser right now in the United States of America, and I don't know where it ends. Now, we got about 3 minutes left. Let me switch gears with you. One of the things you start your book with that I like, and I just want you to touch on, is the caricatures of socialism that are used by both sides when a conversation about socialism comes up. Go ahead.
Right. So to everybody on the left, socialism is essentially a form of charity. It's basically a form of government-sponsored charity. It's all about helping people. It's the right thing to do. These social programs are basically any social program is considered to be a socialist program. I had someone the other day tell me that paying for snowplows is a socialist program. So that's how it's framed on the left. It's a charitable good action for sponsored by the government that everybody's participating in. And so it's always framed in that sort of moral sense. On the right, because the right often gets it wrong too, they define socialism often outside of what the historic philosophical understanding of socialism is, according to people like Karl Marx and others, so that it becomes any sort of government program and it loses all meaning because you're essentially referring to socialism, to any society that has a government program somewhere, as a socialist society. And it actually has backfired very significantly on us, because what happens is the left has been able to then take this and say, well, look at all these countries that have big, gigantic social programs. They're socialist countries, and they're really successful. This is the Scandinavian socialism myth. And they're able to hold those up as examples of socialism working when in reality those are not socialist societies. But the reason that people believe they're socialist societies is because A, nobody knows anything about those countries, and B, because conservatives are the ones running around labeling everything socialism without actually talking about what the historic meaning of socialism is. It's not just a government program. You can have government programs in a society that are collectively owned, that does not mean the whole society is a socialist society by any stretch of the imagination.
Right, and you can also have socialist systems that you and I would vehemently disagree with, but that aren't Venezuela.
Exactly. Well, and the easiest example of this, right? Vast majority of people on the right have no problem with publicly owned roads. I mean, some do, but the vast majority have no problem with that. Well, that's a socialist program, so to speak, the socialist program. But everybody understands that just because you have public roads doesn't mean you're a socialist economy, a socialist society. It's all about the degree to which the society is being controlled by the collective. And at the end game of all of this, communism, which is another, we don't have time to get into that, but people have a complete misunderstanding of what communism actually means, what Marxism actually means. These were wildly utopian ideas. These weren't about jackboot stormtroopers. This was about building this new, beautiful society where everybody would voluntarily choose to collectively own and manage property. I mean, these were not, they weren't talking about, Nazis and the Soviet Union and stuff like that when they were writing Communist Manifesto.
Right.
So you have to, and so when you use language like that, socialists actually use it against you and say, well, look, read Communist Manifesto. That's not what Karl Marx was talking about.
Right.
And it makes you look like you don't actually understand the issue.
No, you're absolutely right. And I have read that, and I understand what you're talking about. And to me, the fundamental flaw with Marx, and I'm sure you agree with this, but the fundamental flaw with all these systems is that they are naive and utopian, particularly in the sense that they are in diametric opposition to human nature. And so they cannot be implemented on large scales without the use of force. And that's where they always end up.
100% right. That's 100% right. And that's why all of the early socialist communist movements talked about creating a new man. This is the language that they often use, creating a new man, a new person who was free from the capitalist indoctrination that they'd suffered under for all these years, because they understood that was not the way society, that was not the way people think. Now, they blamed it on indoctrination, and they said we can just change this by putting people in re-education camps or something. But they all understood eventually that that's not part of human nature, and that you have to sort of re-engineer people to think differently in order for these systems to work on a large scale. And of course, that never works. But when you try it, you end up with violence and tyranny and blood in the streets. And that's what we've seen throughout the course of the last 100 years.
And the bottom line, and we got to leave it there, the bottom line is the fact that a socialist system does require force or the threat of force is a fundamental underpinning of why socialism is evil. If you want to read Justin Haskins' new book, it's a quick, easy read. You can download it for free. The book is called Socialism Is Evil, and you can simply go to stoppingsocialism.com. Justin Haskins, my comrade, we'll use a nice socialist word, at the Heartland Institute. Thanks so much for being here, and keep up the good work on Fox News.
Thanks for having me.
Glad to. When we come back, Polis and Pit Bulls play perfect pals.
This is Denver's Talk Station with Ross Kaminsky now. Dan Kaplis today at 4, 6:30.